Hello everyone, my name is Stone Skeleton and this is my review for Warhammer 40k Darktide. Darktide is a first-person co-op action game developed and published by Fat Shark Entertainment based on the Warhammer 40k Necromunda setting. Up to 4 players will slash and explore through an industrial alien setting, collecting loot, leveling up and regularly upping the difficulty ante as they progress. It's over the top, bloody, and grimdark to the point of hilarity. Darktide may be very well the next logical evolution in the Left 4 Dead formula, which is a genre that is while well tread has yet to see a true successor to the game that popularized this genre. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. To those unfamiliar, 40k is a tabletop war game which has absolutely oodles of lore, books, and video games to accompany it. The vibe of the game is incredibly dark, both literally and figuratively. In the Imperium of Man wages a crusade in an emperor's name, cleansing the universe of aliens and non-believers alike. They are a blatantly fascist organization, but the game's opening cutscene will probably explain more. Frankly, the concept comes off as hateful and ugly, certainly not something I can relate to, but in that way, it seems to be the point. Every race, faction, and creed in this universe was born and bred for war. The Imperium aren't the good guys, saviors, or moral high grounds of this universe. They are an embodiment of the ugliness of man and a villain amongst villains. I could be reading this wrong, but I don't think I am. This kind of mentality in a game probably attracts undesirables who wish to project their misinformed worldview into media, but what is depicted in this game is a parody of how idiotic fascists are. The world of Warhammer 40k is so over the top. Ignorance is hailed as an absolute, a closed mind being protected from the heresy spread across the universe. During loading screens you will see quotes and mantras of this Imperium. Let faith trample reason. A closed mind is a protected one. Seek vengeance, not justice. I'm not going to pretend to understand the overall plot or outline of the 40k universe. It spans dozens of books and cross-media productions. This shit is played for laughs, and any sane person can see it. Window dressing for the backdrop of constant war. In Darktide you will play as a reject of the Imperium, essentially a prisoner who has been recruited to become a soldier in this universe's largest empire. A suicide squad mission, if you will. After escaping a prison ship and doing some tutorials, you're dropped into the hub world, the Morning Star. The Morning Star ship serves as an effective hub world. It doesn't take too long to navigate, and it doesn't take too long to get used to where everything is. It probably just could have been some menus and lists, but the detail given to the ship itself gets it just over the line of justifying its existence. From here, you'll have access to the meat of Darktide's gameplay. The mission terminal and quick play will be your first destination. Games are quick to find and on lower difficulties don't require much communication or coordination. Levels are large, but mostly follow a corridor arena format that we're used to from games like Vermintide and Left 4 Dead. Darktide creates an impressive sense of scale to mitigate this. From time to time, I would play Final Fantasy XIV, and I'd greatly enjoy its dungeons. Until one day I watched YouTuber Never Knows Best video on the game. He pointed out that every single dungeon in the game follows the exact same format. Corridor boss, corridor boss, corridor final boss. Always 3 bosses and always plays out that way. Somehow, it never clicked for me on my own that the dungeons were so formulaic. It was through the amazing art direction and music that it never occurred to me. Darktide accomplishes a similar feat, but takes it a step further by making levels highly detailed and just enough wiggle room for players to explore and find collectibles without being a complete burden on the team. Visually, Darktide is interesting to discuss. It has stunning vistas and incredible attention to detail that bring this industrial hell to life as if it were a real place that functions. Minus the bathrooms. I couldn't find any bathrooms. My friend said that they all probably just shit on the floor and move on, so I'm going to take his word from it. You'll go to train stations, factories, landing docks, and upper wards of society on your quest to eradicate heretics. All gorgeously rendered, with option of ray tracing with those of you with beefy enough computers, which is no one. It feels, dare I say, almost like an actual next-gen game. The detail on literally everything you come across is intense. You get the feeling the artist had a true passion for making Darktide the definitive game to represent the 40k universe, and they succeed absolutely. The weapons, armors, and enemies all get the same amount of love here, creating a level of cohesion that props the fantasy up not often seen in other 40k games. The gore and ragdoll physics here also deserve a mention. When I first played the beta in October 2022, I was smiling ear to ear with the job they'd done. There are many ways to dismember a heretic in Darktide, and they all please the Emperor greatly. My first thought was, whoa, I want more gore, but any more would be distracting to the gameplay itself. That is to say that they dialed it in well. The hordes of fodder that you will face will be great in number, but that didn't stop Fatshark from ensuring that there was a good variety of models to cut down, and so there should be. Warhammer 40k has an insane amount of artistic inspiration to draw from, but it wasn't wasted here. Turning up the ragdolls and despawn timer to max can make cutting down hordes satisfying and distracting. My teammates were often waiting for me while I was swinging my chainsword through the pile of corpses trying to get them into nice itty-bitty pieces. It's not all roses though. While the game is on the forefront of graphical fidelity, it certainly isn't best in class in terms of optimization. I'm using a 3090 and a AMD 3700X with 32GB of RAM, and with DLSS on quality I get between 45 and 60 frames, and the ray tracing and whatnot. I expect Fatshark to plan to optimize further, but just be forewarned that you may not get the performance you expect from your machine. Recently, a developer claimed online that they were willing to sacrifice a certain number of frames to deliver on larger hordes. This might rub some the wrong way, but Darktide certainly doesn't skimp on the heretics. A less obvious problem is something that I alluded to earlier when I listed out some of the mission locales. Train stations, factories, landing docks, all of them follow a theme of extreme, horrific industrialization, which can lead to the feeling of sameness amongst them. This is a baffling feat, to be honest. Rarely do you come across a non-AAA single-player game with this level of detail. How can it all feel the same? To answer this, I compared it to something like musical genres. See, I personally am pretty into death metal, yeah? Now, someone whose only introduction to death metal was that scene in Ace Ventura with Cannibal Corpse, you will generally get the description of Cookie Monster music or something similar from them. To someone that isn't into death metal, it all sounds the same, and yet to me there are layers and layers of intricacies that paint a much larger picture. This is a game that, rather than taking you to locales that may as well be in different universes altogether, chooses to make this industrial hive city feel as lived in and real as possible. There is an overabundance of grey, drab, depressing machinery all around, but it serves as a stellar backdrop to the varied use of lighting that Darktide offers. The lighting of Darktide adds so much it can't be understated to its atmosphere, and that's what Darktide nails best, is atmosphere. Two levels that stand out most to me are Dust and Throneside. Dust is a desert level, which takes the rejects outside the halls and machines into a beautiful red palette town. Contrasting it to the rest of the levels, it literally feels like a breath of fresh air to break up the crushing weight of being inside the factories. It has a real Wild Wild West vibe to it too. Throneside is something that feels straight ripped out of Bloodborne. It has a different atmosphere as the more industrial levels, showing us where the nobility and administrators of the Imperium reside in. I'm a sucker for the nice moonlighting of Victoria architecture, so this level is another winner. Overall though, the presentation is fantastic and is uplifted by the soundtrack of Jesper Kid, which you can find on Spotify. Have a little listen for yourself. Doing some research for this video, I found an interview with Jesper where he said that he used an organ and an array of guitar pedals to create the haunting sound we find in-game, also using a small tribal choir to instill a sense of camaraderie amongst the rejects. The previously mentioned sameness wouldn't feel as apparent if it wasn't for the way that the game doled out missions to players. Instead of letting players choose any mission or level they want, there is a rotation instead, which I imagine the thought process behind this was to not split the player base amongst too many missions, but getting stuck doing the same couple levels over and over does contribute to the levels looking similar. This rotation system bleeds into all aspects of the game's economy too, more on that later. I've talked a lot about the graphics and levels themselves, but this is a looter shooter after all, so how's the loot? Well, overall I'm pretty happy with the selection. Apparently before launch the game was advertised with having over 70 different weapons, but without counting it, it feels a bit closer to 20 if you don't count the variations. This is still a great number, so it baffles me why the marketing needed to push for stating these higher numbers. Off the top of my head, you have a revolver, laser rifles, pistols, ballistic rifles, grenade launchers, and everybody's favourite, the bolt gun. The quality of the bolt gun is seen often to be the key indicator of whether a 40k game is good or not. I'm happy to say, doesn't disappoint here. Before playing Darktide, my concept of the bolt gun was something like a heavy machine gun that spewed bullets, but I was wrong. In Darktide, it functions more like a rocket launcher fired from a large SMG. It feels good to have the destructive power of the former, with the more lightweight feel of the latter. On the melee side we have axes, swords, shovels, staffs, chain axes, thunder hammers, magic-infused swords. All feel great to use, my favourite being the chain sword and least favourite being the thunder hammer. The chainsaw is an exciting power fantasy to wield, but the thunder hammer feels somewhat underwhelming for the heft and destructive power it is meant to bring. Fat Shark are best in class in terms of the first person melee combat, so I have faith that it will be beefed up at some point. Players have a few ways of acquiring equipment in game, but it mostly boils down to buying them from the equipment vendor or getting them as drops from completing missions. There is also no crafting as of time of writing, and the problem with this is that the weapons, like the missions, are on a rotating timer that only sells about a dozen items every hour. This means that there are some unlucky players that could be waiting an undetermined amount of time before being able to purchase the item that they want. On one hand, I feel like this encourages players to make do with the items they have, and save their money for a time when the store has a weapon that they want. But why? Why on a timer rather than to prey on people's precious time and encourage them to play at times that may not be convenient for them? It's just a downright a little bit shady, and no amount of corporate double talk can convince me the system is better than letting players choose outright what items they'd like to use for the game they paid for. That's some free to play shit, and I'm afraid Darktide suffers from this scumbag model of FOMO. But anyway, with this we have 4 classes, which anyone familiar with Vermintide will be familiar with them here too. Here we have the Psyker, the Veteran, the Ogren, and the Zealot, which are your Mage, Sharpshooter, Tank, and Bruiser respectively. They each have their own powers, talents, and 2 to 3 weapons exclusive to their class. Classes don't change much out of the verb of what you're actually doing, that being shooting and slashing, but they do change small fundamentals about how you will approach situations. And there we hit the Pee-wee's fun word of the day. Fundamentals. This is the crux of Darktide's gameplay and its difficulty. The small fundamentals that all equal to a proficient player. A horde has surrounded you. Do you push? Do you dodge? Do you use your special skill to stun the horde while your teammates come to your aid? In Darktide, you will always be surrounded by a horde, so these are decisions you'll be making constantly and will determine whether or not you are successful in a given mission. With a character of the max level of 30, the first 3 difficulties probably won't be a challenge no matter what your skill level. Your equipment and class talents will mostly circumvent any challenge to be found here, so those looking for a chainsword swinging power fantasy will still enjoy helping their low-level friends through these missions. To add a bit of a choice to the difficulty, missions often have modifiers making them easier or harder, such as adding dense fog or reducing enemy density. Players can select missions containing hidden collectible grimoires, which take a chunk away of the player's health in exchange for greater rewards at the end of the mission. This is a nifty little feature that helps bridge the gap between the difficulties. A rule of thumb being that if you can complete a mission with all the grimoires, then you are ready to go up to the next difficulty with that character. I imagine the future will bring more modifiers and more extreme difficulties as the player base becomes more accustomed to the game. Darktide is a lot of fun, so I imagine more than a few people will be devouring this kind of content like flies. It is a game that's repetitive in nature, similar to Diablo in a way that makes me wish for similar modes, such as randomized tile sets, modifiers, and masochistic difficulty, but we can only wait to see what the future holds. All in all, the meat of the gameplay here in Darktide is excellent, with most of its follies being that of many games. Live service bullshit. If you want a fun game with friends that'll run you about 50 hours for most players, I recommend Darktide. If this is the kind of game though that you want to know life like a Warframe or a Path of Exile, I'd probably keep looking. Thanks for watching. What did you think of Darktide? What game do you want to see next time? Drop me a comment and let me know what you think. Cheers. Oh, score? Give it an 8.